in Buddhism around the world. And I would start with the place where I was born, which is in Holland. I was born in Amsterdam, actually, in 1948, January 2nd. And I'm talking about a situation when I was going to Sri Lanka in 1975. What was the situation then? Actually speaking, there was no Buddhist temple or Buddhist center in the Netherlands. There was a small group of people who used to come together twice a year, once in the spring, that is around, let's say, March, April, and once in the autumn, let's say September, October, just for an afternoon. And that was about 40 people, not even 40, of which some people were Buddhists without knowing much about Buddhism, and some, one or two, were actually very knowledgeable about Buddhism. And they would give a talk about Buddhism and maybe guide a meditation and or play a film about Buddhism for other people to watch. And that was about it as far as Buddhism in the Netherlands is concerned. But a couple of years later, when I spent 6 months in the Netherlands in 1978, while I was already staying in Sri Lanka, I went for a longer period to Holland. And just to give an example of what general people knew about Buddhism, I went to the Tropical Museum in Amsterdam to look at an exhibition. I had actually helped in a certain way to put some things in this exhibition about Thai Buddhism and things like that. There happened to be a group of school children and their teacher who were going around the building and looking at this exhibition. And one boy asked from the teacher, who is that? Oh, that is the Buddha. And who was the Buddha? Then the teacher said, oh, he was one of those Indian gods. You know, he didn't know more to say than that. And however, in that same year, a Thai monk who was residing in the temple in Wimbledon, the Thai temple in Wimbledon in London, he was asked by the Thai embassy in the Netherlands to come to Holland and to start a Buddhist temple, because there were quite a few Thai ladies married to Dutch men, and they wanted a Buddhist temple. It was not the Dutchmen who wanted the temple, but the Thai ladies, they wanted their Buddhist temple. So that's the first sort of Buddhist temple that came up. And then one by one, there were other centers which came up in the Netherlands, including a Lama from Tibet who settled down in the Netherlands, and then another Lama who also settled in the Netherlands. So we had a couple of Tibetan centers, and also Zen Buddhism started coming up. People were reading literature on Zen and wanted to practice Zen. Some Zen teachers from Japan or from California also would come and teach there. Now there are actually, a few years ago when I was in Holland, I saw a 2-page large article in a newspaper on Buddhism in the Netherlands, and it showed that around that time, which is now already almost 10 years ago, there were 250 Buddhist centers in the Netherlands compared to 0 in 1975. So that is a huge increase. I don't know how big these centers were or are, how many members they have, and what is exactly the demography, or the the distribution of Asian people with Dutch people interested in Buddhism, because that also happens quite a lot. For instance, when I'm in Holland, for the last so many years, since my father passed away in 1997, I have had hospitality whenever I'm in Holland in a Vietnamese Buddhist temple. First, they had a kind of farmhouse, which was getting older and older and not so suitable anymore. And it was a bit too small for them. So I built a huge temple. And whenever I'm in Holland, staying at that Vietnamese temple. Now, that is typically a temple for the Vietnamese, by the Vietnamese, but Dutch people are welcome on the days of special pujas and ceremonies and that kind of thing. But the language which is used for their chanting and for their prayers and for their teachings is all in Vietnamese. So that not very attractive for the Dutch people. That is the case actually also in other Buddhist centers quite a lot around the world. But if we just look, the very original spread of Buddhism is quite long ago, during the time of Emperor Ashoka. And now 2,300 years ago, later, we see that Buddhism is spreading in other parts of the world. But at the time of King or Emperor Ashoka, it went to places like Sri Lanka, and also to places even west of India. Well, those days there was no Pakistan, it was all part of Mahabharata. Then Afghanistan became Buddhist place. So you may remember the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were blown up by the Taliban. And even Iran and places like that, there was influence of Buddhism in those countries. And even in Greece, there was quite an exchange of information between Greece and the Emperor Ashoka. And even in the style of their statues, you get the Greek influence in the style of the first Buddha statues from Gandhara, for instance. So anyway, that was the spread of Buddhism those days. But now in Europe, some scholars started to study Buddhism and start talking about it and writing about it. And they were spreading Buddhism, like some philosophers, even in Germany, like Schopenhauer, then the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, for instance. In Hungary, de Keurus was a Buddhist scholar who published a number of books on Buddhism. And in England, Christmas Humphreys wrote Buddhism, that was the title of the book, and it was mostly about Zen Buddhism. Then you got the Pali Text Society in London, which translated, from the Pali, so the Theravada Buddhist texts into English. And then in the universities like Oxford University, SOAS in London, King's College of the University of London, even the British Museum was displaying the artifacts which they stole in the Buddhist countries. And they were in a way spreading knowledge about Buddhism through their exhibitions of Buddhist art. Now they are going to return some of those artifacts to the countries where they came from, it seems. So that was something that happened around 1880 in those days, basically. It was like a wave of interest in Buddhism. Then in London, once again, we're staying with London, in 1926, the London Buddhist Vihara was started. So that is one of the first Buddhist temples, at least with Sri Lankan involvement in Europe. But 2 years before that, the it's called the Das Buddhistische Haus, or the Berlin Vihara, was built by Dr. Paul Dahlke in 1924. And that is said to be the first Buddhist Vihara in Europe, the oldest Vihara in Europe. So the different kind of things happening also in the German, what you call domain. There were scholars who lived in Sri Lanka but published books on Buddhism, like Venerable Jnana Tiloka. Jnana Tiloka, Andrew, was living at the Polgasdue Island Hermitage near Gaul, and he died there in 1957. But he had published a number of books, both in German language and in English, which were very, very high quality books on Buddhism. And his student monk called Jnana Ponika, he actually sort of succeeded him, but moved from that island in 1957 to Kandy and started the forest hermitage in Udavattakelni, and also the Buddhist BPS, the Buddhist Publication Society, where they were printing books, original translations of Pali, basically Pali Theravada texts, suttas and all, and they were sent around the world. They said to about 80 countries. They were sending these books, and still they are sending books. I don't know if they've run out of new titles, but they're reprinting also some books. And that BPS, Bauddha Grantha Prakashana Mandalaya, Kila, that is the Buddhist Publication Society, is still functioning and quite strong. There used to be, well, Bhikkhu Bodhi, he was there, Venerable Jnana Tiloka's successor. And then there was Jnana Tusita, a Dutch Buddhist monk, but he disrobed and he is not there anymore, as far as I know. But anyway, that was a very, a force to reckon with in the spread of Buddhism around the world. Then we have, when we want to stay a little bit in the German realm, Ayya Khema, or Sister Khema, as she is called in Sri Lanka. Ayya Khema is what they call her in Germany. Ayya comes from Arya, and she's not like Ayya and Mali or Akanangi kind of Ayya. She was Ayya Khema, and she passed away a few years ago. Actually, now it's already 25 years ago. On the 2nd of November in 1997, she passed away. Recently, they had a commemoration of her death, but also Vesak last May of 25 years of a place called Metta Vihara, which Sister Khema started in Germany after she had already started another place called Das Buddha House. Both of them in some of the most beautiful part of Germany, close to the Austrian border. And I can witness that it's one of the most beautiful places that since I went there every year for about 13 years, from 1997 till 2010, every year teaching a course in the Buddha House first and later on in the Metta Vihara. So Ayakema, she was a strong personality. She came to Sri Lanka in 1979 as Ilse Lederman. That was her original name. She was Jewish, and she had fled the Jewish pogroms and all, and she went to China, and later on she went to California, to Australia, and finally she ended up getting ordained in Sri Lanka under Venerable Narada. And then after 10 years, when the JVP became very dangerous for her island hermitage also, she decided to go back to Germany, and start some centers there. So the two that I mentioned, plus a city center in Munich and some meditation groups in other places in Germany, were all her initiative and of her pupils. So that means she was quite a force to reckon with in German development of Buddhism. Then from Sri Lanka, there were, for instance, Venerable Narada and Venerable Piyadasi of the Vajraramaya, who were the monks who could speak fluent English, for one thing. They knew their Buddhism, and they were willing to travel around the world and spread the word of the Buddha, which they did untiringly all over the world. Venerable Narada was more specialized in Vietnam and Indonesia, where quite a lot of people remember him as he was planting Bodhi trees and starting chaityas and giving people Pali names and teaching Buddhism to them. So Venerable Narada was mostly in those areas. Venerable Piyadasi, I think, was more in Western countries. Then there was a famous scholar in Zen, Taidatsu Suzuki. He was both in Japan and in the US, and spread the Zen teachings through books. He was a scholar, but also a practitioner of Zen meditation. So Zen became quite popular in the Western countries because of T.D. Suzuki. There was another Suzuki. There are so many Suzukis in Japan, but who was called Suzuki Roshi. He was a teacher. Roshi is kind of a teacher who lived in California. And Suzuki Roshi was also, spreading Zen Buddhism in the West. And then a Western author called Alan Watts in the 1970s already, he was writing books on, be here now in a way. That was actually written by another famous teacher who was more Hindu. That is the moment I just slipped it from my mind, his name, Ramdas. But Alan Watts, he was very famous for his books on Zen. Then another famous Englishman who came to India, actually he was in Sri Lanka during the Second World War as a Marconist, Marconist who was doing like SOS Marconist in the army. And after the Second World War, he went to India. He wanted to become a Buddhist monk. He searched and searched and searched, and finally he became a Buddhist monk somewhere in the north of India. And the monk there, he was Indian, Kashyapa. He sent him to a place called Kalimpong. Kalimpong is a very interesting little town. I think Anoja knows about Kalimpong near Darjeeling and Bhutan, Nepal. And Kalimpong, there was a kuti for which was given to Venerable Sangharakshita, and he stayed there. He studied Buddhism. He wrote books, very interesting, very elaborate books on Buddhism. And later on, he was invited by the Buddhist Society of England, of UK, to come over to England and start a Buddhist center there. That was already a kind of a house by the, how is that, northwest London posh area close to the Hampstead Heath. This is Hampstead Vihara, it was called. So Sangharakshita then started what is called the Friends of the somebody calling me. Sangharakshita, he started this Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, FWBO, in England, and it became a worldwide Buddhist organization. Even in New Zealand, isn't it, Gita? They were there, and in Australia, all over the place, and in the United States. So Sangharakshita, he wrote many books, and he did a lot of teachings, and he also actually established a Buddhist organization for the what is called the untouchables in India, the Harijans, who were sort of neglected. Of course, there is Ambedkar also. I'll just talk about him a little bit. So actually, we might as well do that now. Otherwise, I'll never get through this list of people who were influencing Buddhism and spreading it. So Dr. Ambedkar, who wrote India's constitution in 1948, he actually became a Buddhist in 1956 in Nagpur, in a place called Diksha Bhumi, together with 500,000, neo-Buddhists, or what is called the untouchables. It is not a nice word, is Harijans. So he actually is the one who revived Buddhism in India, because the majority of the people actually belonged to that neglected caste, and they were against the caste system. And Sangharakshita started this organization, Tri Ratna something name organization in India, and it's still flourishing. And Ambedkar's movement is still alive, but Ambedkar himself died 3 months after his conversion to Buddhism. And that is a kind of a questionable death, actually. But still, now in Nagpur, I went there a couple of years ago with A.T. Aryaratna and some people, and Naveen Gunaratna, the cinematographer, architect. We went to celebrate something there. And I had to show the film, actually, of Siddhartha, the Buddha, in Nagpur. So there's a huge statue and a stupa around it where people worship, actually, Ambedkar. When they take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, they also take refuge in Ambedkar. So they have the 4 refuges. Yeah. Anyway, then we have another very important personage, that is S.N. Goenka, Satyanarayan Goenka. He was originally living in Burma, Myanmar, and he was a successful businessman there. Only thing is he had headaches, like migraine, and he went around the world looking for migraine specialists to overcome this problem. He couldn't find anybody. And then somebody said, why don't you go to Uba Khin? He was in the government high position. He is teaching Vipassana meditation 10 days, and you could try to follow that course. And he did. And the headaches and the migraine disappeared forever. And so Goenka stayed for 9 more years in the neighborhood of his teacher in Burma, in Rangoon. And then he actually moved to India and started a place called Dhammagiri near Nasik in sort of Western India. And Nasik became the center, the Dhammagiri, and later on there were more and more and more and more centers in India, and also I think about 150 Vipassana meditation centers around the world, which are teaching the same Vipassana meditation as S.N. Goenka did, and they're playing his tapes sort of religiously, and every evening one tape is played with his instructions on Vipassana meditation. But that has also done a lot of good, I mean, for the spread of Buddhism, although he himself did not say this is Buddha's teachings. In the beginning, he avoided saying this. Later on, he realized it's better to tell people that it's actually from the Buddha, but in the beginning he thought that if I say it's Buddhist, then some Hindus might not come, some Christians might not come, Muslims might not come, so we just call it Vipassana meditation. But actually it was Buddha's Vipassana that he was teaching. Then we have an influence in the West from some teachers like Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg. They're called Jubus. It's an American word which is short for Jewish Buddhists. They are called Jubus. And some people say that the institution like the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, which is under the guidance of Joseph Goldstein, and even Jack Kornfield started there, and Sharon Salzberg also, is like a Zionist conspiracy. Somebody said that as a kind of a joke, but of course it's not. But a lot of Jews in the United States turned to Buddhism because they found some kind of spiritual, fulfillment in it. Whereas Judaism, according to some rabbis who were having a dialogue and still having a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, find that in Judaism, it's so formalized and so rigid, and we don't find that much of spirituality in it. There may be, but not in everyday Judaism. So anyway, in 1993, I was part of a meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in this center of the Dalai Lama in the Himalayas, and we were with a group of Western Buddhist teachers and His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And then Jack Kornfield presented a book to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, saying, "Your Holiness, this is a book of addresses of Buddhist centers in North America. I think it includes Canada, and there are 600 addresses in this book, but the next edition is already in print, but it's not yet published, and that will have 1,000 addresses. So you see the number of centers in North America jumped from 600 to 1,000 in a short time. I don't know exactly how much time there was between the first and the second edition of that book anyway. So I meant it, of course, we cannot avoid that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because he, according to me, is the single source for the spread of Buddhism around the world after the invasion by the Chinese army in 1959. You know, if the Chinese would not have invaded Tibet, and if the Dalai Lama would not have had to flee from Tibet, Buddhism, at least in the form of Tibetan Buddhism, would not have spread so much as it has, because the Dalai Lama himself has so much of goodwill and so much of authority and so much of sympathy, so that we can say that, you know, fortunately, Dalai Lama had already visited India in 1956 with the celebration of the Buddha Jayanti, 5,600 years. And then when this happened in 1959, the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, he gave hospitality to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the 100,000 or so Tibetans who came out of Tibet with him. And they started building centers in, in Dharamsala in the north, that is at the sort of the foothills of the Himalayas, but also in places like Bailakuppe near Mysore, and also closer to Hampi, that's also South India. Hundreds and thousands of acres of land were gifted to the Tibetan refugees, and they built beautiful temples and universities. Sera J Monastery and the university belonging to it has about 4,000 students, for instance. Yeah. Is it boring, Dawn, or are you hungry?
I think you're doing very well, Bhante.
Okay. So anyway, these places in India now are very, 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 very active Tibetan Buddhist centers with teachers and reincarnate lamas, rinpoches, geshes, all kind of recognized teachers. Now, just to jump over to France, which we haven't mentioned yet. France is a special case because France used to occupy what is called Indochina. And later on, the people from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they had a chance to settle in France. So they came over and they wanted their temples. And now there are many, many Vietnamese, smaller and bigger. There's a huge temple near Paris, a Vietnamese one called Can An, which cost them $10 million, by the way. And there are other smaller temples also in Laotian and Cambodian. So they're all spread out France. Some of those elderly people also, they were Francophone, they could also speak French, but the new generation, they can speak French, but they keep their Vietnamese and Cambodian and Laotian culture very much alive. So we don't know how much that helps for the spread of Buddhism in the West, because of, if people come to a temple and they cannot understand a word of what is being said, maybe 2 or 3 times they may come and then they sort of stop coming. Anyway, there is another famous teacher. Now he passed away just about half a year ago, Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich is short for Sakya. So Sakya Nhat Hanh. He started a place called Plum Village in the southwest of France, near Bordeaux. And he has been in France since before the Vietnamese War. Now, the Vietnamese War stopped in 1975. The communists won. A lot of anti-communists, Buddhist people from Vietnam, they wanted to leave and they left, some as refugees in small boats, etc. So, and then they started selling spring rolls here and there and making a little bit money, and later on they became quite wealthy and come in their BMWs and their not Rolls Royces, but they come in their Mercedes Benz to the temple and all that. And they're very hard working and very devoted Buddhists. So their example may be giving rise to some spread of Buddhism in the West. Now jumping to another end of the world, namely Australia. Australia, I went there in January 1988 for the first time. I've been 7 times to Australia. I never thought that I would go so many times, but anyway. In that time, there was an article in Time magazine, on the front page of Time magazine. It says, Buddhism is the fastest growing religion in Australia. And that was quite interesting. Of course, in Australia, you do get quite a few people from Southeast Asia who have emigrated to Australia, and they are also Buddhists, quite a lot of them. But they also built their temples and Buddhist centers, and quite a lot of Aussies, so-called Aussies, they come from different backgrounds. They also like to go to these Buddhist centers. So there's quite a lot of interest in Buddhism among the so-called Australian people. A similar thing goes for New Zealand. Before I forget to mention that there's some beautiful temples also. A nice temple of Ajahn Chah's disciples near Upper Hutt, isn't it, Gita? I think I went to your place when I went to there as well. So that was the thing. Then, one interesting thing, I think, is the European Buddhist Union. There is such a thing called European Buddhist Union. There are many Buddhist countries in Europe, 27 basically, and each country has their own Buddhist union. So they try to combine or meet up with people from different denominations, like Zen, Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. All these different schools of Buddhism, they do have contact with each other, and then they have a meeting once in a while. And then once in a while, they have the European Buddhist Union coming all together from all the European countries in their Buddhist organizations. So in 1988, actually, when Dr. Ananda Guruge was the ambassador to France and also to the UNESCO and also to Spain and Morocco, by the way, he actually managed to give the buildings of the UNESCO for the European Buddhist Union's use to have a 3-day meeting in those beautiful and big buildings in Paris. And I was also there. I even managed to get a group of about 45 Taiwanese Buddhists to get their visas through Dr. Ananda Guruge to come to France, and then we traveled after the meeting to Belgium, Holland, and back to Germany. I was observing Vassana period in the Berlin Vihara at that time. Anyway, so that is one big, the first big European Buddhist meeting that took place. And we have another Buddhist organization called the World Fellowship of Buddhists, which was started apparently here in Sri Lanka in 1956, if I'm not mistaken, with, again, I think Dr. Ananda Gurge was there, but also Albert Singh and Professor Malala Sekara. They were here to set up this organization called World Fellowship of Buddhists. That is not monks organization. There's some monks, but anybody can join as long as they're Buddhists. So men, women from all different countries. And after the first meeting in Colombo, they actually shifted their headquarters to Bangkok, Thailand, and it has been there ever since. And they still do meet from time to time. Only the last 2-3 years, maybe because of the pandemic, they could not meet in person. So then there is yet another, sorry that I'm mentioning so many things. This is being recorded, so you can always see it later on. There is a thing called the World Buddhist Sangha Council, WBSC. And that was also started in Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken, and later on shifted its headquarters to Taipei in Taiwan. And every 2 years, they have a global meeting between Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana monks and nuns, and some lay people as well, but it's mostly Sangha, World Buddhist Sangha Council. Very recently, the international chairman or president, Venerable Liao Chung from Taipei, he passed away. And now Chinese Indonesian monk, very young one, but very active, he became the international president. His name is Prajna Veera, or Wei Xiong in Chinese. So those are things that are happening, which maybe you're not quite aware of. Then we have another very big Buddhist organization, maybe the biggest Buddhist organization in the world, is called Fo Guang Shan. Fo means Buddha, Guang means light, Shan means mountain. So Buddha's light mountain. And the headquarters are near Kaohsiung in the south of Taiwan. And the founder of that organization, of the temple, is Master Xin Yun. Xin means star, Yun means cloud. So venerable star cloud, whatever that may be in Pali, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, Master Xin Yun, he came with nothing from mainland China to Taiwan in 1949. And he went around on a bicycle and on foot. And he started doing things to start this center. Now that center is, one part is 80 acres big, 80 hectares, and they've added another 80 hectares on the other side with huge things. And not only that, there are 150 temples belonging to this organization in Taiwan alone, and about 150 temples around the world belonging to Fo Guang Shan. And some of them are actually quite big. Some of them are huge. There's one which was started quite long ago, where Sister Kema, she got her higher ordination, by the way, as a bhikkhuni. It's interesting maybe for you all, in the temple belonging to that organization in Los Angeles. Yeah, and that is called Shi Lai Se, the temple from the West. So, you know, this is something, and I've actually taught English to the Buddhist nuns there. Another interesting thing, There are about 1,000, not domestics, there are 1,000, how do you say that? Ordained people in that temple. And out of them, about 600 of them are bhikkhunis. So you have less monks and more nuns. Then you have Master Xingyun. He's always accompanied by two major, now they're quite old, nuns, very senior nuns and very powerful. So it is, unbelievable here. How is it possible, but it is possible. Then there is another organization I should mention. It's called Tzu Chi Foundation. And that is run by a bhikkhuni, a Buddhist nun. And her name is Chen Yuan, Bhikkhuni Chen Yuan, from a place called Hualien on the east coast of Taiwan. I've been there a couple of times. I know her also personally. She has put up this organization, has grown and grown and grown and grown. When there was a tsunami in Sri Lanka, they came here and they built up so many houses, schools, and the temple, I think, and so many things, hospital also. First tents, blue tents near Hambantota, I think it was. So anyway, this is, it was started by Bhikkhuni, and most of her, helpers and, how do you say, friends are also Bhikkhunis. And then a lot of doctors joined because she started a hospital with free service to poor people. And the doctors also reduced their own salary to help her to run this hospital. This is an inspiring picture of the Buddha looking after the sick monk in very small, what you call small stones and tiles. So, on the wall, huge sort of painting. Anyway, I hope I'm not, am I boring you with all this, or is it interesting?
Not at all, not at all.
Is it okay?
It's very interesting, Bhante.
I hope it's okay, because I can't hear. So anyway, there's a few more things. What do you think? Is it okay? I continue? Okay.
Yes, please continue. Continue, Bhante.
All right.
Continue.
Okay. Fine. So actually, now we go to another place unknown for its Buddhism, that is South Africa. That same organization I mentioned from Taiwan, Fo Guang Shan, they had a number of young men from Congo, People's Republic of Congo. About 6 or so, or 8 of them came to Taiwan. They learned Chinese and they learned their Buddhism, and they ended up speaking fluent Chinese, and they were sent to South Africa near Johannesburg. I went for the opening of that temple also, and that is in Bronkhorstspruit. That's the Dutch name. It's sort of difficult to pronounce, but in Bronkhorstspruit is a huge temple. But fortunately or unfortunately, these young men from the Congo, after some time, they decided that now they know so much of Chinese, they might as well start a business and contact the Chinese business people in South Africa, and they disrobed, and now they are successful, business people. So that was a sort of failed experiment so far in South Africa. But there was an engineer from the Netherlands, Mr. Van Loon, and his wife, Molly Van Loon. they had a Buddhist center, a Buddhist meditation center in South Africa, 325 hectares of land, beautiful, and with a stupa and a huge Buddha statue, Sri Lankan style. And they conducted meditation courses there. And I spent about 2 or 3 months there as well. So then, a place which you might not think of much is Switzerland. Switzerland has the first Tibetan Buddhist center in Europe. The Swiss government was the first one to offer what you call, hospitality to the refugees, the Tibetan refugees. And they built quite a beautiful Buddhist center. I've been there too, in Switzerland, not far from Zurich. And that is, it's frequented by Western Buddhists also. That's true. So because of what is called the diaspora of Sri Lankan, Thai, Burmese, Vietnamese, Laotian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, all over the world, you find that temples in those styles were built and they are being frequented mostly by people of that particular ethnicity, partly because the food is different, the chanting is different, they don't understand the kind of pujas sometimes. So, that's why the Sri Lankans like to go to a Sri Lankan temple, etc., etc. Then we should not forget places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, when they were doing well, especially in the 1980s. They built great, huge temples, huge statues with very powerful bhikkhunis. Not that they didn't have any monks, they had some very great monks too, but small countries with big temples and powerful bhikkhunis. The very famous, biggest Buddha on top of the mountain near the international airport of Hong Kong in Lantau Island was designed by a bhikkhuni. She has a very big, beautiful temple as well. Now, another interesting, what I think is interesting, is in the People's Republic of China. We think about China as a communist country, and maybe they're all anti-Buddhist, Of course, their behavior in Tibet is despicable, that we should definitely stress. But even there, they have allowed Buddhist temples to come up, and there are quite a few Tibetan Buddhist temples in Tibet with quite a few hundreds of monks. But unfortunately, among those monks, there are also spies. You know what I mean? So anyway, they're relatively free to practice their religion again. And I was in a place that is one of the 4 holy mountains. In China, there are 4 holy mountains, and one area is called Wu Dai Shan. Wu means 5, Tai means sort of peak, and Shan means mountain. So the 5 peaked mountains. So that means the northern peak, southern peak, eastern peak, western peak, and the central peak. And in all those peaks or mountains, there are monasteries, altogether more than 108, 108. Now it is more than 109, because there is a bhikkhuni, again, a bhikkhuni, who used to be Secretary of State in one of the states in China. I don't know which state she came from, but she was a government official. She became a bhikkhuni. She started that temple, and I happened to go there because the driver of the monastery where I was, his daughter was a nun there. I got permission to go there. There was a Japanese professor visiting at the same time, and he asked, how is it possible to build such a huge temple? Does the government help them to build it? Then the person said, no, the government only takes money from the monasteries. They charge to visit the monastery. If you're not a Buddhist with an identity card, then the government will charge money to visit a monastery. This is donated by like tycoons from, like Hong Kong, very rich people. They are. And this was like, I don't know how many stories, 5, 6 stories, 4 buildings. The bhikkhuni was giving a talk every day through internet and video, and there were 450 nuns under her. So just to give you an idea of what's happening in China. Also, many other things are happening, but this is one of them. Now, what happened? Yeah, Japan, of course, used to be and still is majority Buddhist. 80% of the Japanese are Buddhists, but they're also Shinto. And but in Korea, unfortunately, Buddhism is declining due to Christian Protestantization. I hope I pronounced that correctly. There is a active movement to make people Christian. And now there are less and less Buddhists in South Korea, let alone North Korea, that's not at all, but South Korea. So then Indonesia, there is quite an active population in Indonesia. Usually people think, yeah, Indonesia is a Muslim country. That is true. The majority of them are Muslim, but about, what is it? 3%, if I'm not mistaken, 3% of the total population, which is about 200 million Indonesians. So if you have 3%, you get 6 million. 6 million people are Buddhists, and they're all very enthusiastic, very well off, most of them. Most of them are Chinese descent, and they are very good in organizing things. They have the biggest Buddhist monument in the world, the Borobudur, in Indonesia, in the middle of Java, near Yogyakarta. And around Vesak, 50,000 Indonesian Buddhists come and converge on the Borobudur to celebrate Vesak and things like that. That's something about. And I've been many times, at least 10, 15 times to Indonesia, and also given talks in certain temples. They have the Theravada, and they have the Mahayana, they have the Vajrayana, and they have the Buddhayana. If you are Theravada, then you're supposed to not touch money, but you can eat meat. If you're Mahayana, you're supposed to be vegetarian, but you can touch money. If you're Vajrayana, I think you can do as you like. Buddhayana also is more free. But we don't know, some of us, and now I saw it again. There was a monk from Bangladesh. Of course, it used to be just Bengal in the 10th century or so, or even before that. Atisha Dipankara Jnana Sri by name. And Atisha came from Bangladesh, from Bengal to Indonesia to study Buddhism. And that was at that time, around the 9th or 10th century, was the center for Buddhist studies in the world. Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, everything. Tripitaka. So he was told that only he should come if he is able to stay for 12 years. Otherwise, better not come. He went for 12 years, and then he went to Tibet, and he spread more Buddhism in Tibet. So there are certain countries which mostly some people may have not heard of. Tua, have you heard of Tua? Tuva. No. There is a record, it is called Back to the Future. It's beautiful, it's chanting in the Tuva style, throat chanting, which Anoja knows about, this throat chanting that the Tibetans and the Mongolians can do. So Mongolia used to be Buddhist, then it became communist under the Russians. And since the breakup of Russia, actually a year later in 1990, Mongolia became what you call democratic and also Buddhist again. And now they've got very strong Buddhist ties here. And the chief Lama, Kambo Lama Dambajev of Mongolia is a friend of mine. In Kazakhstan, Kalmykia and Buryat are some other names of places. Bhutan, with the gross national happiness, which is more important than the gross national income. And Nepal. Nepal is also an interesting case because in the old days, it was strictly what you call Hindu. And Buddhism was not allowed. People were not allowed to become Buddhist monk or nun. They had to go to India if they want to do that. And there's a lady professor called Ria Kloppenborg, who was here in Sri Lanka during my ordination in 1975. She went to Nepal and she did a survey and found 55 monks and 60 nuns those days in 1977. But later on, now there are hundreds nuns and monks in Nepal, in the Theravada. She was only counting Theravada. Well, that's it. Yes, that should be it.